Hello students, welcome to this YouTube channel. Today I will discuss on the particular poem Preludes by T.S. Eliot. As you can see here, this particular poem is in your honors course CC-12 and the name of this paper is British Literature, the Early 20th. In my previous two lectures, I have mentioned something about T.S. Eliot's primary focus as a poet and also as a theoretician and at the same time as a dramatist. And what are the salient features of T.S. Eliot's poetry that we have to know about. And in this particular lecture, the primary focus, the primary concentration will be given on the poem itself, that is the Preludes. Before going to the text of this particular poem, that is Preludes, I must say that the Preludes become a short musical composition. As you can see, that the term prelude is always being associated with this particular perspective. That means the term prelude is actually being associated with a short musical composition on the condition of city life here. Now, what happens, that primarily preludes, this very term is related to any particular song. That means when a song is being performed by a particular musician or an artist, we know that before the song there is a musical composition that comes, and it is being generally considered as a prelude. Now the question is, why T.S. Eliot is using this particular term preludes at the beginning of his poem, or maybe as a title of his poem. Now, as I have mentioned in my last lectures, that Eliot's poems, that means to be specific, if we begin with Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and if we end with the four quartets, that means the four poems that we know, that Little Gidding, East Cocker, Dry Salvages and Burnt Norton. If you think about these poems, you will find that it's a kind of a continuous form of a journey, okay, that Eliot is propagating. And ultimately, if you go through the poems of T.S. Eliot, then you will find that somehow monodimensional, or maybe rather the multidimensional approaches of the poem actually links us, okay, with a continuous form of journey. And this particular poem, that is Preludes, this is actually being considered as the first group of poem written by T.S. Eliot. So generally, when we read Eliot's poems in total, we consider that this particular poem, that is Preludes, has to be treated as a prelude to his literary career. Okay, that means the actual song actually comes later in the form of Wasteland and also the other poems that have been written by him. So what I'm trying to suggest here, that the preludes become a short musical composition, as I began with, on the condition of the city life. As you can see, the influence on Eliot while writing these preludes was both autobiographical and literary. His experience in St. Louis, Paris, London, and his reading of Baudelaire, as we have already found. While commenting on Baudelaire, Eliot remarked, I'm quoting from T.S. Eliot, he writes that poet writing, I'm quoting, poet writing of the possibility of fusion between the sordidly realistic and the phantasmagoric, the possibility of the juxtaposition of the matter of fact and the fantastic. This particular comment is appropriately applicable to Eliot's poetry also. And critics like E.D.H. Green and Bernard Berganzi consider the Preludes as small-scale equivalent of Baudelaire's two particular poems. In English they name as Evening Twilight and Morning Twilight. The seamy aspect of Paris, evolved by Baudelaire with its glimmering gas jets imagery, prostitution, The lightning of street lamps, etc., finds an equivalent in Eliot's poetry also, that is, the poem Preludes. Eliot's Preludes then becomes an imagistic representation of urban life, as you can see here, recorded without comment. Opposing Bergson's theory, Eliot shows the images of life is devitalizing, or that is, it has been devitalized. The cosmos is not presented as evolving progressively forward in this particular poem, but are devitalized in the crowd and dirt and smoke. We will come to that later. Ultimately, through this particular poem, we will find there are ample references of various kinds of images. The preludes are unified in respect of mood and imagery. They are an antithesis to preludes that is written by Frederick Chopin and William Wordsworth. The urban atmosphere of the poem reminds us more of Blake's London. If you go through Blake's London, you will find the particular kind of images that Blake has used there. Eliot is to some extent referring to them, where the observer moves through the chartered streets and takes note of the squalor, monotony, and horror. Larkin's Whitsun Wedding, as I have already discussed about this particular poem, it is in this particular channel. It describes the suburban London through a comic satiric point of view. And this is present in Eliot's Preludes also. You can find the same temperament is being incorporated. As we will go with this particular text, the first and the second preludes written in a kind of a close succession, as we find, and together they lead into an epistemological concept entertained in the third and the fourth. And all agree in imagery, as we find in the writing of Grover Smith. All are there in T.S. Eliot's poets and plays. So before going to discuss the poem with its critical angles and critical perspectives, let us begin with the first prelude, that is Preludes 1. As you can see here, that the typographical differentiations are always very important and significant. As it has been propounded here, Eliot writes this particular poem, he writes them by referring to 2 or 3 or 4 different segmentations have been taken for consideration. The poem, that is the first section of the preludes, that is actually being considered by the academicians and the thinkers as first prelude. It is focusing on the winter evening, as the title, this particular term has been there. The winter evening settles down. What I'm trying to suggest here, that while I will go with this particular poem, as I have discussed and described in my previous discussions on Eliot, that we need to focus on Eliot's pattern of writing. Okay, as I mentioned, that in Eliot's poems, you will not find that Eliot is directly mentioning the focus or focusing on the deterioration that is perceptible in the London society. Rather, we will get some snapshots. What kind of snapshots? The snapshots of the society that it portrays. It begins in this particular fashion. The winter evening settles down, with smell of sticks in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. So as you can see, this particular begins by referring to Baudelaire's Evening Twilight. There also a particular kind of a discussion, a description has been made regarding the settling of the evening. Okay, because it was the evening twilight. So fundamentally, what I'm trying to suggest here, that Eliot is writing with a reference to the negative aspects, as you can see. As I mentioned, that the primary focus of this particular poem is not simply to describe the fundamental descriptions that we find in Spenser's Fairy Queen, or maybe the idyllic landscapes that have been taken for consideration by William Shakespeare or maybe Philip Sidney. Rather, the particular society that Eliot is portraying here, it is something degenerating, you see. It is completely being degenerated. The society where you can find a kind of a spiritual vacuum or spiritual vacuity is being perceptible. He writes, the winter evening is settling down. There is no particular problem in this particular reference with smell of sticks in passageways. Now, the typical form of olfactory image that Eliot is referring to, the smell of sticks. As you can see, the sticks is a kind of a preparation that is made out of meat. And the smell of sticks that can be associated with something kind of a rotten smell or so. So this fundamental olfactory implication that Eliot is propounding here, you will find that with the different kind of images, whether it is the visual image, whether it is the gustatory images or the olfactory images or maybe the thermal images, you will find that Eliot is actually indicating towards a kind of degeneration that is prevailing throughout London during this time. Because, as I've already mentioned, that whenever we will find the London that have been portrayed in Eliot's poems, whether it is in Preludes or Rhapsody on a Windy Night or maybe in Hollow Men, ultimately you will find that the fundamental focus of this particular poem or all these poems, the representation of London has to be treated as quote-unquote the wasteland that Eliot is propounding, where there is a particular reference to the spiritual, vacuity or vacuum that is being perceptible. There is no particular reference to some positive incorporations. Now, he says that the winter evening is settling down and with the smell of sticks in the passageways, so again the negative impact, 6 o'clock. Now, as I've already mentioned that T.S. Eliot's poems has to be treated as a typical representations of the modern poetry, right? So fundamentally, everywhere you will find the kind of a disjointed references are there. The holistic orientation that we find in the typical romantic literature, okay, all these things will be missing because modernism is always focusing at a kind of a deep fragmentation. And when you will look at a deep fragmentation, you will find that the structure of the poem, the presentation of time, the presentation of life, the presentation of human being, all have to be treated with such a kind of disjointed orientations. Similarly, you will find that when Eliot is writing a particular time, it is not a kind of a holistic representation will be there. It's not a simple a day. It is not simply an year. It is not simply a month. Rather, it is 6 o'clock. You will find 7 o'clock. You will find 9 o'clock. This will be, say, powerfully being imposed by the poet in Rhapsody on a Windy Night. So why these times have been incorporated? You will find that the presentation is any time at any moment. You are taking snapshots. And when you are taking snapshots, the time is actually referring to any particular moment. But now, when you are thinking in terms of the society, you will find that one particular moment is actually indicating towards the another moment. So all these moments are disjointed, and ultimately, whenever you will treat the moments, you will treat the society itself, you will find that the fragmentation is perceptible in everything. Right? So what I'm trying to suggest here, that with the reference to the time, as you can find in the typical postmodern painting by Salvador Dali, there was a kind of a reference to the floating or maybe the melting times in the form of the the clocks. Okay. Similarly, in case of Eliot, you will find it is completely being broken. Okay. But when you go with the poems like Burnt Norton, you will find it is a kind of a continuous flux that Eliot is actually referring to. Time present and time past, with both perhaps present in time future and time future contained in time past. So this is a different matter. But here you will find that Eliot is referring to a kind of fragmentation, both in case of time, also in case of disjointed parts of the bodies. Okay, you cannot get a total body at a time. You will find either finger or maybe soles or maybe feet or anything, the parts, as if you were looking at the human beings with a perforated sheet. So you cannot get the total picture at a time. He writes, therefore, the winter evenings settles down with smells of sticks in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. Wonderful imagery that he is incorporating here, he is using here. That is, the days are compared with the burnt out ends of smoky days. That means as if like a cigarette, the fag ends of a cigarette. When the cigarettes, the essences have been sucked up and now a skeleton has been left, the remaining has been left, the filter has been left, and it has been thrown out. So you cannot expect that everywhere you will get, the essences are left there. No, all the essences will be sucked up. You will find the skeleton is being left. So generally, when all the essences have been sucked up, when the skeleton has been left, you will find that the essenceless existence of the human beings, of the society, is at the primary focus of Eliot's poems. So that's why all the negative terms, if you think of the smells of sticks, if you think of the burnt of ends of smoky days, all these evoke an atmosphere of decay and death. Okay, the urbanity, the typical form of urbanity. And at the same time, it is a kind of a representation of the typical London life that Eliot is propagating here. So the winter evening settles down with smells of sticks in passageways, 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. And now, almost in a theatrical way, almost in a dramatic way, a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet. So as if you were standing. And what happens, a gusty shower is there. It wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves. So everywhere, the terms like grimy scraps, the terms like withered leaves, everything, each and every kind of representations, or maybe use of words, use of images, all are associated with some kind of negative incorporations, you see. Okay, so what it says, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves. Again, you will find the essencelessness being incorporated. The withered leaves are coming, and as if with the flow of the air, it comes to your feet, and you will find it is not simply the typical, wet, withered leaves. Rather, also there are references of the newspapers. The newspapers from the vacant lots. Again, another term, vacant lots. These are referring to the matter of uselessness. And when the newspapers are flying and it comes to you, there is nothing useful there. Why? It has been read out already. It has been read by the persons. And when you think in terms of the old newspapers, you cannot get anything to be left for them. So whether it is the grimy scraps of withered leaves, or maybe the newspapers from the vacant lots, everywhere you will find the impact, the particular imagery that is he is incorporating in this particular poem. It is hinting towards a matter of futility. So the burnt out ends of smoky days, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from the vacant lots. And then the showers are there. The showers beat on broken blinds again. The blinds are broken. And chimney pots, so you can find some auditory images in being incorporated again. And at the corner of the street, you see a lonely cab horse steams and stands. Again, a kind of an image that has been created. The lonely cab horse that is standing there, it is steaming its shackles and stamping as if, it is also feeling a kind of disgusting mood. The typical form of disgust is not only present within the scene, within the scenery, within the poet persona who is present, the speaker of this particular poem, but also the other living character that is present in this particular scene. You will find that these are somehow, or this is actually referring to the cab horse, and it is also steaming and stamping as if out of frustration, as if out of, a kind of, bad feeling that it is getting. Disgust. And that's why the steams and stumps. And that's why it is Eliot. He's mockingly, in a dramatic way, ironically, he's referring to the lighting of the lamps. So everywhere in these lines, as you can see, in all these lines, there are all the negative informations have been provided. And then, as you can see, that in the typical form of canonical texts, we find that the lighting of the lamps are always being associated with something positive. You will find here is a typographical gap. Okay, the gap is in between this particular line, that is a lonely cab, horse, stamp, steams and stamps, and then the lighting of the lamp. So there is a big gap in between. So ultimately, in this particular gap, there is a kind of a suspicion that is being there. Right? And with this particular dramatic, ironic orientation, Eliot says, and then the lighting of the lamps. So the lighting of the lamps is actually indicating towards a kind of an irony. In spite of all these things, the lamps are being lit. They are lighting, you see. So what I'm trying to suggest here, you see, that in this particular section, that is section 1 of this particular poem, you will find that the images, the observer actually here, he wants to maintain the strict actuality and objectivity. But these detachments that we can find at the very beginning of this particular poem become illusory. From the description of the atmospheric gloom and the confined ardor of cooking, the observer moves outside into the smoky twilight, where this gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps, the gust of wind that whips up the leaves that are shade and the soiled paper. Probably it might be possible the soiled papers that have been used for toilet or something like that. The shower beating and spatting on the broken blinds and chimney pots, the housetops evoke an atmosphere of cleansing. But this is not a particular effort, as it is closely related to the stamps of the cab or cab horse that implicitly presents the mud of the city situations. The moral and social wasteland of pre-war era gives an indirect hint to the forthcoming collapse of Western civilization, obviously. And Eliot uses the adjectives that you can find here, the smoky, grimy, withered, broken, vacant, all these terms actually, these are evoking the tone and the decadent atmosphere of St. Louis, which in turn parallels that of London and Paris. And finally, the lightning of the lamps at the end of the poem reminds us of the Baudelaire's Evening Twilight, which actually describes in a similar way the lightning of the streets of Paris. The first preludes, as you can see here, it presents the imageries from Eliot's direct experience of the grim realities of city life and transmutes his personal observations into poetry. So how these images can be associated, can be related with the remaining sections of this particular poem, as we can see that from Manju Jain's writing on T.S. Eliot's Preludes. If you go through the Oxford edition of Eliot's writing, you will find that the Preludes 1 and 2 were written much earlier than the Preludes 3 and 4. It was written far later actually. You can find that as it has been pointed out that Preludes 1 and 2 were written in Harvard in October 1910, and third was written in Paris in July 1911, and fourth at Harvard probably sometimes after November 1911 or possibly in 1912. So generally you will find that somehow the poems are also disjointed parts, but Ezra Pound and other editors, they actually associated all these 4 sections into one, and how these are being related one to each other, and how they totally, as a holistic poem, how they are incorporating Eliot's temperament in the form of poems, in the form of the society and presentation of the society, we will find in our next lectures. Stay attached. Thank you.